Good to see you all guys. Hope you all doing well. Good to see you guys. Saw just a little bit ago. Today is it's a very special day. There's actually a holiday today, in case y'all didn't know this. It's National Slap Your Coworker Day. Now, I was like, okay, now. Alan's very glad. He's very glad I probably didn't come across this thing. No, I saw it. Went, okay. National Slap Your what? You know who? And so they actually gave. I saw a little blurb right about it. They actually gave instructions about how to practice slapping someone properly. And I don't know who actually is celebrating that. Probably if someone does celebrate that, they've either been fired or they're about to be fired. I would think that'd be the only way you could get away with that. I do know this. I'm pretty sure that that would not be something that Paul would talk about as being Christ-like in Philippians chapter 2. So there's our segue. We'll be in Philippians chapter 2 tonight. Of course, we've been here for some time. Last week we wrapped things up at about verse 14. We looked at verses 13 and 14 of chapter 2 last week. So this morning this evening we're going to begin with chapter 2, verse 15. So as you find your way to Philippians chapter 2, let's begin this evening with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we are grateful tonight that you have loved us, so that you have treated us in such a merciful and compassionate way. And Lord, we pray that we would, in fact, love you as you have loved us, and that we would extend to others the love with which you have loved us. Lord, as we look at your word this evening, would you teach us, and would you use that to strengthen and encourage us this day and the rest of this week to live in such a way as to honor the gospel. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. I want to actually begin reading at verse 14 of chapter 2 of Philippians. Apostle Paul says this: "Do all things without grumbling or disputing, so that you will prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent children of God, above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I will have reason to glory, because I did not run in vain, nor toil in vain. But even if I am being poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I rejoice and share my joy with you all. You too, I urge you, rejoice in the same way and share your joy with me. But I hope in the Lord to send Timothy to you shortly, so that I may also be encouraged when I learn of your condition. For I have no one else of kindred spirit who will genuinely be concerned for your welfare. For they all seek after their own interests, not those of Christ Jesus. But you know of his proven worth, that he served with me in the furtherance of the gospel, like a child serving his father. Therefore I hope to send him immediately, as soon as I see how things go with me. And I trust in the Lord that I myself also will be coming shortly. But I thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, who is also your messenger and minister to my need, because he was longing for you all and was distressed because you had heard that he was sick. For indeed he was sick to the point of death. But God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but also on me, so that I would not have sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore I have sent him all the more eagerly, so that when you see him again, you may rejoice, and I may be less concerned about you. Receive him then in the Lord with all joy, and hold men like him in high regard, because he came close to death for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was deficient in your service to me." So Paul begins this in verse 14. That's what we're going to pick up with tonight there in verse 14. He's given them a command, and of course this is all attached. There's really not any break between verses 13 and 14. This is all attached. And from really the end of chapter 1 through this portion of chapter 2, Paul has been giving the Philippian church some instructions and giving them some ways to what he began with in verse 27 of chapter 1, which was conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel. And so as he told them to do that, he's been helping them understand what that looks like and what that means. He's talked about having the mind of Christ. He's talked about being selfless and kind towards others. He's talked about doing this all with a right heart. In 27, not only did he say, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel, he talked about that looking like this. Standing as a church and understand all these commands that Paul is giving are to the church. They are communal. They're plural. And so he told the church to stand firm in a unified spirit and mind. He told them to advance or to work for the sake of the gospel. Okay, this as a church. Verse 28 of chapter 1, he told them to be unafraid of those who oppose the gospel, recognizing that their suffering for the gospel was actually a gift from God. They would suffer even as Christ has suffered. So not a usual way we're thinking about suffering or going through hardship, but Paul told them it was actually a gift from God that they were suffering for the gospel. Chapter 2, verse 2, he talked to them again about being unified and doing nothing from selfishness. And then chapter 2, verse 5, he held up the example of Christ and all that he did in leaving heaven and humbling himself to the point of death on the cross as our model. We're to live for others and for one another in the same way Christ did for us. And in verse 12, of course, then to continue to work and obey for the glory of God in unity. And so this is all what's going ahead here. And then now verse 14. So do all this. Be unified. Suffer. Advance the work of the gospel. Stand firm under persecution. All these things. And do it without grumbling. Now that, no, he wasn't talking about us at all. Now, that word grumbling, that's one of those words that kind of sounds like what you do, right? When you're grumbling, you kind of make that, there's that rumbling sound. It's kind of that idea. Do we ever hear about anybody ever grumbling in the Scriptures? Who was known for grumbling? You're going, okay, take your pick, right? This is the exact same word that's used to describe the people of Israel repeatedly in the Exodus. In fact, I could take you to some. We could begin in Exodus chapter 16. There's actually, as you might guess, quite a bit of reference to the people of Israel in the desert grumbling. Exodus chapter 16, verse 7. Let me go back to verse 6. Moses and Aaron said to all the sons of Israel, at evening you will know that the Lord has brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, for he hears your grumblings against the Lord, and what are we that you grumble against us? And this was before God gave them manna. They were grumbling about their food. We could go chapter 17, verse 3, also of Exodus. The people thirsted for water. And they grumbled against Moses and said, why now have you brought us up from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? As if God had brought them out of Egypt just so he could kill them. Now, you guys probably know the Exodus story fairly well enough to recognize that it actually happens a lot. Grumbling is one of the regular things that the people of Israel do throughout the book of Exodus and throughout the entire time that they are in the desert and that God has delivered them. And in fact, even the New Testament, and Paul does at times as well, to some degree compares the stage of history that we're in as a church sometimes to the wanderings of the people of Israel in the Exodus. So follow this. They have been delivered, redeemed, saved, if you will, out of Egypt. And where are they headed? To a promised land, to an Eden-like place. And in those 40 years, they're in between. Now, they've been redeemed, but they haven't gotten to Canaan yet. They haven't gotten to the promised land yet. And the Bible does this a couple times, too. Paul will use this kind of as an analogy. We've been redeemed, we've been saved, but have we reached heaven yet? No. So we're in between, right? Sometimes, does it ever feel like you're in the wilderness? Well, we are in a process of moving from one place to another. God's doing a work within us in the meantime. So Paul uses this a couple different times, and even here, he's telling the Philippian church, listen, God's going to bring you to some stuff. And what you have to do is realize that whether you are suffering, and you might be suffering because God's bringing some suffering on you, so that you can exhibit the gospel just as Christ has done through his suffering. Be unified, love one another, put up with this stuff, do all these things, and do it without grumbling. Don't be like Israel. Don't be like them. Now, most of you, either maybe when you were a young person, or maybe as you had kids, or maybe grandkids, know what it's like for you to either obey your own parents or grandparents, do what they told you to do, but under your breath, to grumble. Did y'all ever do that? Maybe not loud enough for them to hear, but you did it, but you were grumbling. Or maybe as a parent or grandparent, that's happened to you. You told them to do something, and they might have eventually done it, but they grumbled. Maybe they grumbled about what was for supper. Maybe they grumbled about having to take out the trash or clean their room, whatever it might be. They obeyed technically, but they grumbled. And so Paul says, stop it. Don't grumble. Now, that's easier said than done, isn't it? Now, grumbling doesn't have to be just that sarcastic retort under your breath. We can grumble. You know, the Philippian church here seems to be going through some difficult times. They're being persecuted, as often happened to the early church, wherever they were at. And it's one thing to go, okay, I'm going to endure some suffering. Now, there's a couple different ways I can endure suffering. I can endure suffering. I can just take it, put my head down and keep on going and be gracious. God's given me this or give me that. But I can also perhaps endure it. I don't give in to suffering, but I can also be complaining about it the entire time. Why do I have to do this? God, what did I do? What did I do to deserve this? Why am I having to? Didn't I learn this lesson last year? Y'all ever kind of complain to God, or is it just me? We can grumble and complain. If I'm complaining to God about this or about that, what am I saying without saying it? What am I really saying to God? I mean, I don't like this God. What am I really saying to God by complaining? I'm not content. Don't like this choice. I'm questioning God's judgment, am I? Okay, I'm self-focused. I know I've told this story before, but it's one of those nights that I just remembered, being irritated and inconvenienced and upset. In Atlanta, they called it Snowmageddon. But we had whatever, I don't even remember the exact date, but it was one of those years that you had kind of an unforecast ice storm. And so we, between the hours of like 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. one day, half inch of ice fell down. And I don't care where you're from, if there's ice, it plays havoc with you. And then now some snow started to fall afterwards, but the entire city of Atlanta was covered in ice. And y'all may not realize this, but the northern part that we lived in is actually very hilly. So guess what happens when you have a half inch of ice on roads that are up and down? You don't go a lot of places, Well, I lived, the church was about, 15 to 18 miles away from where we lived. We couldn't afford to live close to the church. So I lived probably about 12:30 or so. It was on a Wednesday. We canceled everything. And between our house and the church, there were 3 different routes to get back. All of them were 2 lanes. All of them were hilly. So I picked the one I thought might be the least traveled of the 3 routes, and found out pretty quickly that apparently everyone else had the exact same idea. And after about half an hour of going absolutely nowhere, picked another route. Eventually got moving. But the long story short, I got to within about 3 or 4 miles of the house by about 6 o'clock that night. So I was on the road for 6 hours. I went about 12 miles in 6 hours. And it's getting dark. where I'm stopped at's right in front of the high school where Ben was going to high school. And so it's on top of a hill. So I'd been there for at least 35, 45 minutes. So I get out, sort of walk down the hill a little bit and realize it's a place where there's hill on both sides coming into a little valley, and there's like a 6-car pileup as cars had fallen down the hill and valleys on both sides. In other words, was not getting home that way that day. So left the car where it was at and walked in the snow and ice the last 3 miles or so. And got home about 8 o'clock that night. And you're like, it took me 8 hours to get home, walking through the snow and walking through the ice. Man, what a miserable day. And then I got home and realized I had nothing compared, it was nothing compared to what people had been going through that day. We had people that we knew in our church had been on the road who actually ended up spending the night on the interstates in Atlanta. It took them 20 hours, 24 hours to get home. I had one good friend of ours who did the same thing I did. He only got so far, decided to walk the last 4 or 5 miles, fell on the ice and shattered his elbow. So when I began to realize all that, I was like, oh, I'm home. The car's off the side of the road. It's fine. I had something warm to eat. I'm doing pretty good. And went from being irritated and grumbling, I was grumbling, to realize I need to be content. Now that's just a little. Sometimes we don't get past the grumbling part, though. The Lord was able to show me that night, Brett, just shut up. Paul says, don't grumble. In fact, he even says, he adds a different word. He even says, there's no disputing. This actually has the idea of, it's an argumentative word. He's talked to the Philippian church a couple times about being unified, about loving one another. And chapter 4, we'll see here in a couple weeks, or a few weeks, that there actually seems to be a couple people in the church that are grumbling against one another. And so we don't necessarily think the Philippian church had a major problem yet, but there does seem to be some indications that Paul is trying to get them to nip something in the bud and get this taken care of before it turns into a big deal and divides the church. So he says, listen, do all of this. Endure the suffering, love one another, live a life worthy of the gospel, advance the gospel, do all this stuff, live in the way you're supposed to live, and do it on top of that, essentially with a really good attitude. Don't grumble about it. Don't point it out. You don't need to talk to somebody, oh, my life is so hard, and you just grumble in a different way. Be content with the decisions that God's made and be grateful for what He has done for you. And if God deems you worthy enough to be gifted the gift of suffering, Paul says, take it without complaining. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be bouncing up and down happy about it. In fact, we're going to see that here in just a few moments. But he does say, don't grumble, don't dispute, don't get argumentative. Verse 15, so that you will prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent children of God above reproach. So, these things, this attitude that doesn't grumble, that is content with what God brings into our lives or what God allows us to endure for the sake of the gospel. This is one of the evidences of spiritual maturity. This is one of the things that God is doing within us that enables us to advance the gospel. Now, this idea of proving yourself, this is called elsewhere fruit. We've had this conversation. We know this. The fruit is not what saves you, but it's evidence of a genuine salvation. And here Paul is talking about this discontented spirit is a problem. It's a contented spirit that's evidence of the maturity and the fruit and the growth and the work of God in your heart and in your life. Doesn't mean nobody's signing up and going, ooh, can I suffer? Nobody's doing that. But if God's allowed that to come into your life, if God, in this Philippian church, they're like most churches in that era, they're undergoing waves of formal Roman persecution or oftentimes just the informal cultural persecution that comes from being on the fringes of society there. They were not looked upon generally by society in a good, positive way. But he says, don't grumble or complain about it. I'm wondering Do Christians ever, do we as Christians ever look at our world and just complain? Of course we do. Now, I'm not talking about what I think is one of the roles of the church, and that is to point out to our world where we have veered away from what God has told us to do and to be. But sometimes we go from that to just whining and complaining, don't we? I don't know. I don't want to step on too many toes here. What would it look like in the United States if Christians just were content with what God gave them and even endured things graciously and gracefully like Christ did on the cross and didn't whine and complain all the time? I'll just throw it out there because I know there's no whining and complaining going on right now. Nobody does that during an election season. So, just throw that out there. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, so that you will prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. Now, understand, Paul is not sugarcoating the world they live in. He's not telling them, listen, you're not complaining about the stuff you're grumbling about. It's really not that big a deal. He's not saying that. He's acknowledging that they live in a perverse, crooked world. Okay? Now, I think we might even use those same terms today at times, right? That we live in a world which at times appears to be pretty perverse and crooked, not trustworthy, immoral even. But we aren't in the ancient Roman Empire. Understand, that's a different beast to live in the ancient Roman Empire. If you think it's bad here, and it is, I'm not saying it's not. It's pretty bad there as well. In fact, probably I think safely to say it's worse. And so, understanding the context that they're in the ancient Roman world, he still says, don't grumble and complain, and don't be divisive. Instead, prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent. And remember, he's already held up for them the model of what Christ did and how Christ handled the assignment God gave him. The humility it took for him to take on human flesh and die, even to the point of dying on the cross. So that's our model. Not only did he do that for us, he gave us a lifestyle to emulate, to imitate, and then to do it without grumbling. We don't have, obviously, Jesus didn't do this, but can you imagine there's at least 3 times that we know of that Jesus told the disciples, I'm going to die. Now, they had a hard time figuring that out. They didn't really still expect it. But can you imagine him saying to the disciples, by the way, here in a few weeks, I'm going to be betrayed, I'm going to be crucified, I'm going to die. He tells them that. But let's just say for the fun of it, he says, I'm going to do all this. Man, this seems unfair. I can't believe the Father has me doing this. I'll do it, but I'm not happy. Can you imagine Jesus talking like that? No, that's the exact opposite of what Jesus said. So again, what Paul's saying to us is, when God takes you through stuff, act the way Jesus did. And don't grumble or complain or be divisive, but endure it in such a way as Christ did for us, and prove yourselves as a result to be children of God. Now, he describes it, who are above reproach in the midst of this crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in this world. Now, that word lights, actually, in Greek, it's the word that we get the word star from. It's actually the word, it's in the Greek language, it's the word for star. So we are, he says, to be a loving, united people, standing firm for what's right, resisting, living blameless lives, resisting sin, so that we can be lights to the nations. By the way, Israel was given this same task. Didn't always do very well. But this is actually based upon a passage in Daniel. And the very last chapter of Daniel, Daniel chapter 12, there is a reference to this. In chapter 12, the first 4 verses of chapter 12 of Daniel, we get this. It's looking towards the end times. At that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise. And there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book of life, or in the book, will be rescued. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. Those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expansive heavens, and those who lead the many to right and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. So Daniel's looking to the end, and there is this idea that before the end, when things are getting really bad, that there will be that the people of God, those who have followed him, who are God's people, those who have insight, their lives will shine brightly like the heavens, like the stars, leading people to righteousness. Now, there's a church vision statement, isn't there? To be a people whose lives are so righteous that they're leading a dark world to righteousness. That's pretty cool when you think about it, I think. That we're to be a people whose lives lead others to righteousness. Now, of course, that means we need to attain to some level of righteousness. And it also means that I can't complain about it. Oh, this righteousness. Oh, what a bummer. No, I'm having a little fun with this, but you get the idea, right? So, this is what Paul is inviting us to. Jesus talks a couple of different times in the Gospels about being light like a city set on the hill, or the lampstand in a dark room. Here's the thing about the pictures that Daniel gives us, or that Jesus gives us, or that Paul is even referencing here in Philippi. Darkness does not overcome light. Now, we may be, there may be, if we were to turn all the lights off here, we'll have here in a couple months, we'll have a Christmas Eve service, and we'll have candles and all those type of things. All the lights will be off. And even if there's 70 or 80 or 100 people in here with candles, the room is still more dark than bright, isn't it? It's not, we have all the lights on now, so it's pretty bright, but even if we have 100 candles in this room, it won't be this bright, will it? But those candles stand out in that dark room, don't they? You can't mistake. The darkness does not put out the light. In fact, sometimes the darker the room, the brighter even that individual light appears. See, here's the thing. Here's one of the things that Paul's talking to us about, I believe, and to the Philippian church about. That even if the world feels dark, and it feels like it's getting darker, you be light. And even if it's frustrating, even if it feels like the darkness is creeping in and making things harder, all that means is that your light will shine all the brighter. We know just from history, as difficult as this is to accept, that the church has often had its biggest growth spurts. The gospel is often spread the most when the church was persecuted and in difficult times. It's even been that way in the 20th century, the early 21st century. Some of the fastest growing movements of Christianity and the gospel, even in the world today, are in parts of the world that it's actually illegal to be a Christian. That's some of the fastest growing areas where people are accepting the gospel because they're being oppressed and the light shines in darkness. So Paul says, listen, this is your job. This is the goal. You are brought into the gospel. You're brought into the kingdom of God, and this is one of the things it means to do this and to be lights. And to do it, verse 16, by holding fast the word of life. That's a term that just references the gospel. So holding fast to the word of life. So what does it mean to hold fast to the gospel? what does it mean to hold fast to the gospel? Well, yeah. Now, fast is a word we usually think about as being, quick. But this has that idea, like fastened to something where it can't be removed. So once you're onto it, you're not letting go. You're tied fast to it. So yeah, you're gripped it. You're attached to it. So hold fast to the gospel. So if I'm going to hold fast to the gospel, what does that mean as I live tomorrow? What does it mean for me to hold fast to the gospel in whatever it is I do tomorrow? What does that look like? What does that mean? What's that? It directs me, okay? Get faithfulness. Give me an example of what it might be for the gospel to direct me tomorrow. I want to ask you to give me a practical. Okay, so the gospel being Jesus, really Paul kind of went to the gospel, really talk about the mind of Christ, didn't he? So we could take that idea of Christ leaving heaven and doing what he did for us on the cross, resurrecting, and that guides my decision making and how I maybe interact with somebody, or whatever the case may be. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I've got a boss. Yeah. Okay. So I've got a boss. Yeah, I'm working for the boss, but I'm actually working for God first, and I'm doing that by working for the boss. Now, some bosses may make that easier. Some bosses may make that harder. But yeah, what's happening when I'm holding fast to the word of life, my decisions are based upon what advances and glorifies God, what advances the gospel. So when I'm interacting with somebody at work, or when I'm at Walmart, or whatever, how I decide what I'm doing or how I decide I'm going to react to something should be shaped by the gospel. So when someone does something to me that's hard, or I think is wrong or unjust, I should be thinking about, well, how I respond should reflect the gospel. Now, I'd be lying if I said I did that really well. I don't always do that real well. But in theory, that's what I'm supposed to be doing, right? The gospel. So that means whether I'm working, whatever you do to offer the glory of God, whether it's working, out in the yard, shopping, driving, boating, I'm doing all those things first and foremost to advance the gospel. That's going to be my first consideration. How do I do that in such a way that advances the gospel? Grasping that word of life, holding it fast. So that now Paul says this in his little personal application with the church of Philippi. He says, so that in the day of Christ I will have reason to glory. Paul, to a certain degree, I think, he's kind of been under house arrest for a while. He's like, I don't think he actually thinks it's in vain, but he's going, you guys do this, and that way I won't have done all this in Philippi for no reason. He's kind of wanted some assurances there. And then verse 17 says, and even if I am being poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, and there is a picture here, even as part of the temple sacrifices, but it actually was not wholly uncommon in even pagan rituals, is that they would make the sacrifice, and then after the animal's been killed and put on the altar and all those things have been done, they would take a cup of wine and pour it out as a drink offering, as a Thanksgiving offering, as a libation offering. And so Paul has this picture of what's going on in the temple and the sacrifices. And even though we're not doing sacrifices anymore, He's just taking that image and saying, even if my life is right now being poured out. Now, I think that's a fairly obvious metaphor. He's picturing something. He's saying, listen, even if my life is being poured out, even if I'm going to die soon, and he said to us a couple times in this letter he didn't think that was going to happen just yet. But he says, even if that's going to happen, even if my life is near an end, even if I am being emptied out upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, even if I'm dying in this jail, what does he do? I rejoice. And you too, I urge you, rejoice in the same way and share your joy with me. So here's how this little sequence of verses goes. He begins with, don't grumble and complain. And he ends it with, in fact, not only don't grumble and complain, rejoice. I don't know about you, sometimes it's all the work I can do not to grumble and complain, and much less rejoice. But you see where Paul's at with this. And Paul has said this a few times already, and he's going to say it again. We've talked, the letter to the Philippians, joy is one of the operative words throughout the entirety of this letter. So he's saying, listen, don't just hear. Joy doesn't mean lack of suffering. Joy doesn't mean I like the pain. It just simply means I understand and I'm content with what God's put on or taken me through, and I'm looking for ways to honor Him and glorify Him through this, knowing that there is an end and knowing that there is going to be a reward, knowing that God is doing something that I want to be a part of. I don't know. We have no way of knowing this side of heaven. Sometimes I read these letters to churches that were around 2,000 years ago, and I wonder if I could trace back. People like to do genealogy studies every once in a while and trace their DNA back, the biological DNA. I know where I heard the gospel. I know I heard it from my parents, heard it from the pastors when I was a kid. I wonder sometimes if I could trace back the gospel lineage for 2,000 years. This guy told me, that guy told him, that guy told, if I could trace back 2,000 years. Am I here because some guy in Philippi told somebody in Philippi? Am I here because some guy in Thessalonica shared the gospel with somebody else? I have no idea. I don't know. There's no way I could know. But joy realizes that God may use even my difficulties to do things that I'll never see that are going to be glorious and fantastic and bring joy in heaven. So, I don't know. There's no way we can really answer that question, but it would be a fascinating thing to be able to find out, wouldn't it? I think it'd be kind of cool to be able to figure out the lineage, so to speak. Paul's going to wrap up this chapter. We're going to hit these last 11 verses pretty quickly here. He turns to some personal remarks and talks about how he's going to send Timothy to them. But here's what the next 11 verses, what they're really going to be looking at is this. He wants to send Timothy to them to check up on them, see how they're doing. But first, he's going to send Epaphroditus to them. Epaphroditus is the guy that brought to Paul the resources and probably some money and some things from Philippi to Paul in jail in Rome. And so Epaphroditus was the one they sent. So whatever resources they sent, Epaphroditus was that messenger. He's the one that gave Paul the information. Here's what's happening in Philippi. We love you, we're grateful. Here's some help. And we don't really know what happened or why it happened, but apparently sometime while he was with Paul in Rome, Epaphroditus gets sick. And in fact, Paul says there at the very end, he got sick to the point of death. And he says because he came close to death for the work of Christ. So I don't know, risking his life to complete. Maybe he got sick on the way. People would have said, you need to go back home and get better. But he plowed ahead at the risk of his own life to get to Paul. I don't know. Maybe something happened while he was in Rome with Paul. We don't know. But whatever it is, Epaphroditus had a task to fill, and he wasn't going to leave it undone. And he got sick to the point of even death. Now, we also know that he got better, And Paul's going to send Epaphroditus back to Philippi with this letter. So the letter we're reading right now is the words that Epaphroditus is going to take back to the church in Philippi. So the timeline we see here in Philippians chapter 2 is Paul's going to send Epaphroditus back with the letter. Once Paul finds out or gets an idea of what his faith's going to be or what his conditions are going to be with his particular trial, at that point he will send Timothy back to Philippi to let them know the status that he was going to come back to where Paul's at, and then Paul's hoping to himself return to Philippi. We do have some reason to believe that Paul may have eventually gotten back to Philippi, but there's some speculation that we're not really sure of. But Paul talks them through all this. He talks about Timothy in particular. He says, the reason I want to send Timothy is because I know that Timothy and I are we're lockstep. And the next thing to me being there is Timothy being there. We think alike. We're of the same spirit. We're on the same page. So if Timothy is there, I'm there. That's the sense of what he's saying. He does make he takes a little shot. Paul does. He says, I have no one else of kindred spirit who will genuinely be concerned for your welfare, for they all seek after their own interests. I have a hunch that what Paul is talking about, if you go back to chapter 1, Paul talked about there around verse 15 that there are some people preaching the gospel, not from pure motives, but in kind of to antagonize Paul. And Paul said, listen, I don't care as long as the gospel is being preached. But you can tell those are folks that are not doing things on the up and up. And I have a hunch that's what Paul's talking about here. And then before the end of this chapter, he talks about them in verse 28, 29, how he wants them to receive Epaphroditus. Now, one of the questions I might have asked is if he came from Philippi on their behalf to represent the church to Paul, why does Paul have to make sure they treat Epaphroditus right when he gets back? Why does Paul have to say, make sure and welcome the guy that you sent me? Why does Paul have to say that? Let's see this here. The church sent Epaphroditus. He says, I have sent him all the more eagerly so that when you see him again, you may rejoice. I was concerned about you. Receive him in the Lord with all joy and hold him in high regard. Hold him. Why does Paul feel the need to kind of bolster Epaphroditus to the Philippian church? Any ideas? Give you some brain teasers. Okay, yeah, part of it's just, yeah. Everyone needs a little bit of, get a little pat on the back. Doesn't hurt, does it? Helps you. Okay. I think one possibility might be this. How does Paul know that there might be some divisions and difficulties in the church? How's he going to know that? And who probably told him? Yeah. I just kind of wonder, Paul writes this letter to the church, and of all the letters Paul writes, Philippians it is by far the most joyous, affirming letter. I mean, the Philippian church seems to be a really good church. But, Paul does deal with this issue of, listen, make sure we don't get into division here, and he even names in chapter 4, he's going to name names, make sure these two people are getting along here. How does Paul know that? Well, probably Epaphroditus told him. And so when Epaphroditus takes the letter back and they read this, they're going to say, what did you tell Paul that for? And Paul's going, don't you get on him now. He did this because he loves you. It was right. Esteem him. That's just a personal theory of mine. I can't say that for sure. It kind of makes sense to me, though. Yeah. I think Epaphroditus kind of filled him in on the details. Paul, be praying about this. Paul said, I'll do more than pray about it. I'm going to write a letter about it. And Paul said, listen, you guys make sure and welcome him because he has risked his life for you guys and for the work of the gospel. All right, we're going to take some time here to pray as we wrap up chapter 2. We'll begin with chapter 3 next week. If you're watching with us online tonight, thank you so much. I encourage you to take some time to pray as we do that here. You all have a good evening.